Tere hommikust from my part as well, and thank you, Tea, first of all, of course, for the kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in Estonia, but I'm not sure if I so much appreciate the easy task you laid on me here, because that was a tall order. But I can hopefully bring my perspectives, at least, in terms of maybe trying to help all of us to address all that, but I don't think I can solve that, otherwise I would be Finland's Donald Trump, probably. But yeah, so it's not that easy. So just to sort of kick off, of course, I think almost all of Europeans and people around the world are now aware that we live in really in the midst of geopolitical turmoil. But in Europe, we're still mostly really focusing on the wrecking ball that Russia sort of has thrown on the European security order with its illegal war of aggression on Ukraine. And whereas it's great that Europeans are perhaps finally also waking up to the sort of fundamental change in our international system, we still tend to be very much focused on that. And because of that, I always tend to sort of start by just reminding us that the war in Ukraine, even the war in Gaza, are not the only sort of geopolitical spots of turmoil that we're seeing at the moment. Of course, we this year had wars elsewhere than just Ukraine and the Middle East. So you might remember the short war between India and Pakistan, two nuclear states. It wasn't the first conflict they have fought, and we always been concerned of the potential or the escalation potential between those two countries should there be a full-scale war. But we also have a lot of other potential geopolitical hotspots around the world. Just to name a few, of course, everybody's concerned about Taiwan Straits, South China Sea. We see this sort of tensions building up. The Korean Peninsula is still a major potential hotspot. So we shouldn't be maybe so narrow-minded in terms of how geopolitical sort of conflict around the world can affect on Europe as well. So it's not just geopolitical conflict, of course, in Europe that has an effect on us, but because of this sort of economic interdependence that we lived on for the past 30 years, conflicts on the other side of the world can also have impacts on our daily lives in terms of our economies or especially businesses, and especially businesses obviously working on an international business. So it just, we need to be, I think, more aware of these things. But there's a lot of uncertainty clouded around this as well. So for some reason, we're always taken by surprise when these hotspots sort of erupt. And I think that to a large part also applied to Russia's illegal war of aggression towards Ukraine. We were all aware that that conflict had already begun in 2014. We kind of saw the build-up, but yet we were still mostly taken by surprise. And this seems to be the pattern with most geopolitical crises. We're sort of aware of them, maybe even like thinking about them, and maybe that's why we have a bad tendency to be taken by surprise. And if we think in terms of how we could make that better, so if we really just focused and tried to predict sort of independent individual sort of events, and we're really bad at it, maybe we should have a more systematic approach. So in a sort of also in the spirit of what the center's doing here, I would say we should maybe focus more on this sort of system level change elements and factors, trends that are happening. And the most sort of significant in this sense is that we are living in a sort of transformative moment in history. So for the past 30 years since the Cold War ended, we were living in this sort of notion that the neoliberal and economic and political order had won over, obviously, the sort of communist order that was competing with it before. And we kind of declared an end of history. So famously, Francis Fukuyama declared that we now see the end of history. The neoliberal model has proved its supremacy. Democracy will spread. We will reap all benefits from the neoliberal economics through globalization, from this sort of borderless opportunities that are waiting for us. And to be honest, we had some really good times for about 30 years, especially in Europe. There were also people, of course, that weren't content. So whereas we thought globalization will benefit largely everybody, or at least majority, unfortunately that was not the case. And we've seen that also in politics in the US, that a lot of people just were not content of this. And the system is also breaking a little bit from inside. But we know also that China, Russia, Iran, and others are very much coming together and very much systematically challenging this sort of neoliberal, so-called rules-based system that they just seem dominated by the US hegemony and the West in general. And they want to create a more fair and multilateral system to replace that. So why would we be surprised if they actually take action on those promises? But yet we seem to be avoiding thinking about this. I'm not saying that the rules-based order, the order we enjoyed for the past 30 years, is over and it's going to be totally gone. But it is, I think, realistic to say that there's so much change pressure that it probably does not continue in the way it has for the past 30 years. So change is inevitable. The good news is we can still influence that. So our actions can still influence the kind of future that will be molded up. But would be good to sort of be aware of this and be aware of the potential of a change. So we can't just go and think that things will continue as they have been for the past 30 years or so. So probably we should conclude that history did not end. We just had a really nice holiday from it. And that holiday might be over now. So I think this sort of acknowledgement of a challenge in a sort of system level is the first prerequisite for us to actually take action and then mold this future into something that is more desirable for us. One of the biggest, and in sort of connecting to today's theme, one of the biggest part of this phenomena is the rise of geoeconomics. So what do we mean by geoeconomics? We're basically talking about the use of geoeconomic policies, geoeconomic relations towards advancing strategic, so political goals. So this means that economic decisions are not only made purely based on economic logic anymore. This sort of security thinking and economic thinking is being intertwined. And sometimes it's a little hard to sort of predict which one kind of takes over. But the important thing is to understand, and again, this sort of past 30 years, we believe that there's this separation between politics and business, government and businesses, and that we want to keep these two things separate. That's more or less the foundation of the European Union as well, that we keep the political and economic decision-making as far as possible separate. It's never been complete separation, but that gap is now growing. And that means also that in the global level, obviously everybody's aware of Trump's sort of obsession with tariffs and how the use of that is sort of another wrecking ball in the global economy. But it's not the only thing. So again, I would say there's this systematic change that is much more fundamental. And the first bit is, of course, this sort of weaponization of economic activity. So we see it from our own actions as well, that we use instruments such as sanctions to affect our adversaries' economic well-being, economic strength, in order to coerce them to behave separately or even to break them. So there is this sort of malicious use of economics that is taking place. And I'll talk a little bit more about the other sort of means that includes. But it's important to understand that this is happening. The economy is being weaponized. As a counter-reaction to that, we've seen a rise of economic security. So it's also becoming a new norm, including in Europe. So even including the European Commission has taken steps, the new Commission has taken steps towards this. So we have a Director General of Trade and Economic Security, for instance. So even in Europe, we're sort of getting into this sort of intertwining of security interests and economic interests. And overall, this means really that the sort of WTO system that took years through the GATT process to build up is a threat. So we have to sort of acknowledge that the WTO is taking quite a bit of hits. We probably can't, depending on the way that small countries like Estonia, Finland, and Nordics have for the past decades or years become sort of accustomed to being sort of relying on. And in the worst case, this will really create this sort of balkanization of the global economy. So again, in the globalized world, we saw a borderless world. That's probably not the case anymore anyway. But in the worst case, we really see separate sort of competing strategic spheres like Europe, China, and United States competing against each other also in geoeconomics. Just really briefly, so how governments use this. There are sort of these 4 distinct strategies that we can observe at the moment. So we can use this sort of geoeconomic means strategies towards coercing others to behave in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. So really sort of essentially blackmailing them or impacting their economies in terms of them changing their political decisions. We can try to bind them into our interests through economic means. Of course, the Belt and Road Initiative by China, the Global Gateway by Europe are examples of this. We wedge our opposition in some cases, so there was a big fear, for instance, Trump might try to wedge the European unity and offer sort of bilateral incentives to individual countries in order to break the unity of Europe. And this can happen between allies, so wedging between the relations between allies and friends and partners anywhere. And then we do a lot of hedging in terms of try to protect against the adverse impacts of geoeconomics as well. So just a little bit about those. We don't have time to go into depth, but just so that you get sort of a contemporary overview what the type of instruments being used at the moment. Of course, we talked about tariffs. It's clear that tariffs have a negative impact on international trade. How much exactly, we don't know yet, and it probably haven't had the type of the level of impact that we feared so far. But we know in general that most economists don't look at tariffs as a positive thing. Sanctions, and it's not sanctions as such, but the way we use them. So the sort of secondary sanctions, especially that do not only target states, but also organizations and individuals, so also businesses, is something new. So this is relying mostly something that was built on after 9/11 in terms of disrupting terrorism financing. We're now using this in the context of, for instance, sanctions towards Russia, China, and Iran, and others. Export controls and, of course, also import controls that aim at regulating sensitive goods. We have our list of what's sensitive in our economies from national security point of view. I would only make an observation here at the moment that list is growing and probably can't grow very much anymore, but the trend is that the sort of selection of what's considered sensitive is broadening. The strategic corruption that can be used towards really undermining stability in economies or societies. There's industrial and economic espionage that is increasingly used to steal our innovations. So if we invest in innovation policies that come up with solutions that help our economies, our security, adversaries are increasingly, this has always been going on, but have increasingly also aiming at stealing those. On the other hand, this defensive side, so we're building up hedging against the sort of negative impacts of geoeconomics. We see not just inbound FDI screening, but also outbound FDI screening, which is something the European Commission is preparing at the moment. So not only what sort of foreign investment is seen potentially disruptive or harmful for the economy, but also what we don't want to be, investments we don't want to direct against towards certain locations. Data localization, data maybe is said to be the new oil. Not sure about that, but it is certainly very sensitive for national security. So obviously we see a lot more sort of regulations aiming at the localization of trade data so that it can't be freely moved across, which was something we got quite used to. A lot of businesses built on their growth on the fact that they can move knowledge and data information across borders using systems like SAP and so forth. Science and technology cooperation restrictions are getting more and more in place. So, for instance, restrictions on obviously doing scientific research with institutions that are linked to countries like Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, and others. Critical infrastructures, we realize that critical infrastructures are increasingly becoming a means towards hurting us sort of below the threshold of war. We've all seen the events lately. We've seen obviously the undersea critical infrastructure sabotage taking place between our countries as well. And there is this clear need that also the European Commission has reacted to really protect these critical infrastructures that are mostly privately operated against also state-based threats. So that's a big thing. Reshoring subsidies, so we're seeing more and more use of governments subsidizing critical technologies, manufacturing, innovation to be brought back. This is one of President Trump's, for instance, big themes, of course. Bring back manufacturing into the United States, especially in terms of, for instance, critical semiconductor technologies, making sure China does not get those capabilities and will be able to compete with that. New industrial policies. Industrial policy used to be a swear word at the height of the sort of neoliberal era, right? It's back. In what format? It's still a little bit difficult to say. I'm going to make soon a point that there is a key tension in this regard that is going to both sort of restrict and drive it. But it is back. And the same goes, of course, for innovation policies. So, and in this regard, I'm mostly speaking in terms of in the context of innovation policies to improve our defense and security, of course. Now, so just go a little bit, because I talk a lot to business leaders, and one of our main really objectives for me is always to make them wake up to this change that is ongoing. What are the key consequences of all this change, this transformative change we're seeing in international system to international businesses, especially, but also local businesses? First of all, the golden era of globalization is over. I'm not here to declare globalization is totally over. I don't like these sort of extremes. That's probably not the case, but the kind of optimistic globalization we enjoyed or did not enjoy, in some cases for the past 30 years, that is over at least for now. So you can't think of this sort of world being unlimited sort of opportunity, borderless business. We can do business everywhere, and the governments in general don't really intervene. Of course, there's always been regulation, there's always been certain export controls and import controls and all that. But by default, you can't rely on this assumption anymore. That is the message. And this means that in a lot of cases, access to markets will be restricted more. It will be more limited. We can't just decide to enter a market because it is lucrative or it looks potentially very lucrative. Access to some key materials obviously is being limited now. So China, for instance, has taken counter steps in terms of limiting the export of certain raw earth materials that we require for manufacturing of many technologies. And other resources as well. Finances, same thing again. Finances are not borderless anymore. Even talent is not borderless anymore. So we can't just go and very sort of optimistically pick talent from here and there where the talent is best and bring it to where we need it. There's a lot more restrictions already on that, and there's more restrictions going on. American semiconductor experts or managers are not allowed to work for Chinese companies or work in China. So if you just sort of put that image into your mind, you realize that we are on a different path in this sort of global pool of talent as well. And data, like I said, you can't rely on sort of assume that you can freely move data between your operations in different countries and regions. It's not going to happen anymore. I'm sorry. And in lots of cases, we see increasingly companies are treated as useful instruments by states as well, because companies in our countries especially still really essentially control most of the economy and most of the sort of positive economic capabilities. So why not use them also as a tool to either hurt others or at least use them as targets? So if a country wants to hit country B, it might make sense actually to essentially attack companies from that country. I don't mean physically necessarily, even though that doesn't seem to be off the rule book at the moment, but hurt them in terms of their business, their interest. So all in all, what we're really seeing that I used to work for Nokia late 90s and to early 2000s, and then again sort of mid 2000s. And the thinking in companies like that was that we just do business. We're not in the politics of business. We're just connecting people, right? So, governments take care of all this politics stuff. We just do business. And because of that, we can freely operate in countries that are hostile to each other, like, for instance, in China. Now it turns out Nokia and Ericsson have been signaled by the Chinese government that they're probably going to be excluded from the Chinese market. So that is over. It's about really picking sides from this point onwards. Not absolutely in all ways, but you need to be open to that. Some of the key tensions really that I wanted to talk about, so kind of linking back to productivity and competitiveness and all that. So the first one is really this fundamental tension between the logic of efficiency. So we're used to this just-in-time sort of extreme efficiency, as opposed to this sort of resilience type of just-in-case thinking, so that we need to build up robustness and redundancies in order to withstand shocks. And those investments in redundancies and robustness are often quite hard to justify with just economic logic. They always seem like a bad investment, especially in sort of short-term thinking. But somehow we need to find a balance between these two. So obviously we can't go and invest a large chunk of our economic resources into just being safe and just to be secure through investing in robustness and redundancies, but we do have to do it, because if we don't survive, we're not going to be competitive, we're not going to be productive. Then the other really fundamental one that is really directly linked to this transformation in the international system is that balance between the sort of neoliberal ideas that we're still mostly attracted to, right? And sort of a strategic capitalism. So really essentially deciding where and how state can intervene in the economy. So if the old thinking was that the state intervenes as little as possible, mostly just really to guarantee sort of very basic safety, security, and consumer fundamental rights and so forth, such as privacy, for instance. Now we are seeing a shift. So it's not anymore that we don't intervene, but we don't want to become sort of state capitalist system either, where the government controls businesses more directly, can intervene where it sees fit. So most likely we're going to aim at or end up with something at least that is more selective. So the government's going to intervene in sectors that are more sensitive to the geopolitical, geoeconomic pressures and national security, but not in everything. And now you just need to understand to what category do you belong to, and not just now, but also in the future. So a lot of dual use sort of technologies weren't originally dual use. They are securitized into dual or multi-use through the potential of using those technologies to military purposes or security purposes. But anyway, so all this balance, how we find this balance is going to really determine what is going to be our sort of future policies towards FDI screening. Can't go very much further, I think, but it is, it is necessary. But how far do we go? Again, industrial policy and innovation policies, and hopefully maybe in the question and answer session we can talk about this more, how the European Commission is also changing its attitude towards these things. State aid and subsidization. It's been a curse word. It's been something that the single market thinking in Europe has been quite hostile to, even though national security is clearly and has always been a competence of member states. So there is this big tension in terms of national security being the competence of the member state, not the European Union. But on the other hand, that you can't use national security justifications as a blanket justification for subsidizing certain industries or businesses, for instance. Public procurement is an enormous issue. So we do have a lot of challenges in this regard now that we are beefing up, for instance, defenses and so forth, that it is maybe a little bit too regulated. But how much do we want to open it up? And all in all, this sort of really suggests this sort of increasing tension between security and competitiveness. So they don't have to be polar opposites, but the dynamics are generally a bit opposite. So they can be brought together. We can find sort of hybrids. We can find solutions that address sufficiently both aspects, our security and our continuous productivity and thus competitiveness. So it's not impossible, but we need to find this balance. We're not very far with that. We are still scrambling. The European Union is scrambling, the member countries are scrambling, the world is scrambling in these terms. So we're not very far along this road. Just a couple of things for governments. So really, what I just talked about, we really kind of need to first acknowledge, I think, these tensions, and then we need to solve them. So we really need to make a lot of value and interest choices in terms of finding the balance between these tensions. And security is imperative at the moment. There's no doubt about that. But does that really apply to the whole sort of selection of technologies and sectors, even if they are security sensitive in lots of ways? So AI, I think, is a good example of this. It's clearly national security sensitive issue. But do we really need an industrial policy for AI? Is it really realistic? Is that going to really help us in the long run? And especially in small countries like ours, where the scale is always going to be limited anyway. So again, I think you need to consider the security aspects, but the security aspects must not dominate the policy. It has to be taken into consideration. They can't dominate if we want to be competitive also in the future. Unless we want to go to that state capitalist system, then it's fine. We also should see some of the opportunities from this. So even small governments do have opportunities for leveraging through mostly partners and alliances, bigger scales, the potential opportunities from geoeconomics from this world as well. So we shouldn't just be doom and gloom, but we should aim at sort of actively shaping our future, essentially. So this applies to everything. If we sort of decide everything's going to hell, we doom, fine, we don't do anything. But this is all about human decisions. We can still shape these things through by our actions. And we don't have to slip into protectionism. Just really, really quickly. So what I always tell business leaders is first step, really rethink. So if your strategies are still built on this positive notion of hyperglobalization, you need to revisit and rethink your strategies. In some cases, they still might work, but in a lot of cases, they're increasingly challenged. Think more strategically about resilience. So not just sort of bouncing back when there's a shock, try to recover our operations, but also in terms of how can we adapt, how can we transform ourselves, our operations after shocks, maybe becoming better. Improve the understanding of all the different dependencies and vulnerabilities in the global supply chain, but also smaller supply chains, because there are many now emerging. And if you're blind to them, you're taken by surprise, and then you're in trouble. And establish this geoeconomic agency either independently or in cooperation with your sector branches or sector unions and other sort of partnerships to shape the government policy. The government should listen to you. So, of course, the governments need businesses for economic security. They can't really do it without businesses. They don't always understand what really drives businesses to make their decisions. And they sometimes really misunderstand also the capabilities of businesses. So there needs to be this growing dialogue. And like Thea said, I'm kind of involved in building one now in the sort of Nordic level. But again, just to close with what I started with, before we can really take any meaningful action, we need to really acknowledge that the frame is changing. So if we try to sort of act based on the old logic, we will fail. We really think in terms of how do we act in this new world, not in the old world that's now gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This really was a awakening and thought-provoking presentation. I would say it was very gloomy, but very grasping. So I hope this you made the points. I know you made the points. And there are some questions also for discussion that audience has posted to the workshop environment. However, I'd like to have a quick look around the audience. If someone would like to grab a mic and have a comment or a question, so please feel free to do so. Or then perhaps take some time to consider. And let's start with the questions that we have here. So the first one is really rather. Well, the message has come down, I see from the question as it is posed, that your presentation described quite a bleak future for the economy. What would it take to turn that around?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I always tend to aim at sort of shocking, and this comes from talking with a lot of business people that by default are very optimistic in nature and incentivized to be very optimistic as well. So they don't like acknowledging these things. They just like, checking how can we still operate in China and do it in a competitive manner. I'm going like, you can do it if you really acknowledge these tensions, if you acknowledge this sort of vulnerability and this risk. Yes, you can probably, depending on what sector you work actually, you can probably still do it. But you need to first be aware that really the sort of dynamic, the logic of the system is changing. So don't rely on whatever old assumptions you had. Yeah, I'm sorry if I got really doom and gloom. That's not really the meaning as such. But like I said, there is hope, so we can take agency in this.
Indeed,
these are human decisions. So we shape the world. There's nothing outside power that sort of shapes the world for us. If we decide to doom and gloom, then it will be.
Well, you were very clear that it is a balancing exercise, basically, and the security considerations should not really dominate the economic policy, but be included into it and thought through. So this was really kind of a common sense approach. I like that very much. Another question along the same line, basically, is the free market and invisible hand now history, and for how long? You mentioned we have a holiday from history. Would it, well, in some thinkable future, to be turned around again, or how do you see it?
Yeah, again, it depends on actions of different parties in here, but we can really have our bigger. So, for some reason, as Europeans, we tend to underestimate ourselves and the power of Europe. We're really afraid of Russia. We're really afraid of China. We need to somehow, go on our knees in front of Trump and so forth. And yet, I mean, we're a major superpower in terms of economics, and our potential from this massive sort of economic power into other power as well, if we want to have it. So, from going to soft power to hard power, if we need to do that, we can definitely do that. Mm-hmm. So it's again all about how do we address this. But so what I see, especially from sort of business side, but also from government side, is that because we don't think about these things early enough, and when they happen, we kind of go into this shell shock and start seeing risk and threats everywhere. So I think it's good, for instance, that Europeans have woken up to the threat of sort of imperialist Russia. But we should not let that dominate ourselves or our future. Otherwise, we let them win, really. So why do we act these ways? And the big reason is really that we don't, I don't know, humans have this tendency, we don't want to think about bad things before they really happen. And that's just really unhealthy for us.
There is a question about sustainability. And will this be thrown out of the window now as the focus shifts towards economic security?
I wish I could predict that. Of course, the tendency is quite gloomy at the moment, but no, I think so far we're sticking to our guns. So if you think in terms of the European Green Deal and all that we have to do this, even if the United States and others are sort of dropping out from this sort of shared actions or joint mission. We still need to stick to it. So we don't have to. I think we can perfectly, again, find the balance between sort of meeting up all these other strategic challenges such as climate change, competitiveness, productivity, and security. As long as we don't let any of those just dominate our thinking completely. We need to become more strategic, really, in terms of thinking about both our risks and our opportunities.
You recommended the companies to actively shape and influence government policy where possible. How? On their own or with the help of government affairs agencies?
Yeah, exactly. So, of course, bigger companies have more means doing that. But actually, even in that case, I'm more favoring actually taking sort of joint action and not just sort of sectorally. So, like I said before, we kind of started maybe 10 years ago sort of coming up with these national security sensitive sectors, and we started generally with, a small number, 5, 6, so forth, and then went to 12, and now we're kind of approaching 20 in a lot of cases. So it's already, going to affect most of you, if not directly, then through your partnership and customer relations. So it would be better to sort of probably come together and help governments also understanding that now that they need the businesses in terms of really having any effective economic security in national terms. Because most of really this sort of economic power and agility is in businesses. So governments can't do economic security without the participation, active participation of businesses. But they often, like I said, misunderstand the interest, what drives businesses and what they can really do. So in the worst case, if they take too drastic action, businesses will move. I know in Finland too, they're thinking, well, that won't happen. It's exactly what's happening already. So some companies will actually choose rather to leave than be part of this. But again, so if we have this sort of dialogue, honest dialogue between the government and the businesses, whether it happens through the sort of sectoral bodies or otherwise, is super important. So I would say more cross-sectoral dialogue with not just these security sensitive sectors, but all sectors would be very beneficial.
You mentioned there is a need for compromises between efficiency and security, so that in order to have more security, we need to compromise a bit in terms of productivity and efficiency. However, here is a question that perhaps the economic security focus or in the broader, I mean also the security and defense focus could support some great success stories like has happened in history before. Chip manufacturing, for example, would that be an opportunity?
Absolutely, that's the thing. So in some ways, I'm always a little bit concerned when we go to this sort of length in terms of, even though it's necessary, in terms of being dominated by defense and security industries. Because like you said, there can be a lot of positive spillovers from there, so it's not necessarily just bad. But how do we how do we actually somehow enable and manage those spillovers then to come? So there's the sort of Russian option. If you have a look at the Russian economy now that they're in war economy, they seem to be pretty robust. But we all know that that can't last forever. And then what will happen to the economy when they have to give up the war economy? We don't want to go into the same trap. So there is this sort of risk of the toothpaste sort of coming out of the tube, and then it's really hard to put back in.
Indeed.
So again, it's a balancing act, and we need to think very carefully where do we want to apply this security and defense-driven policies and actions, as opposed to more just competitiveness-driven policies. And AI, again, I think might be one of good example. I don't know if small countries like ours really ever going to have the type of scale that would justify industrial policy, but you may disagree.
I have a look around the audience. Have there emerged any wishes? Yeah, there is. Okay. Let's snap a few more minutes. We'll go with this.
Very short question. There is a theory that people are divided into three groups according to the adaptation tempo to change.
Yeah.
1/3 very quickly, 1/3 slowly, and 1/3 won't adapt to change at all.
Yeah.
If you look at the global map, how would you use this theory? Thank you.
I think this might be the good news for us in the Nordic-Baltic region. We tend to be pretty nimble. We've gone through some very drastic changes, I think all of us. Maybe the Baltic states more than the Nordics lately in the recent history. But we tend to be more open, more tolerant to change, and also to drive change. So it's not about just being okay with things changing. Actually, a lot of times when I talk about resilience, in some ways I see it as a change strategy. How much change we can tolerate or want to tolerate in whatever the system or country or company when there's a shock. So do we want to bounce back to the status quo that was before the shock? That's not very tolerant of change, right? Or do we allow sort of marginal changes so we don't give up being Estonia, but we change the things, like how things work inside Estonia in order to, secure that Estonia will continue, even though it will be a little bit different, but it kind of retains its meaning. Or then there's this sort of renewable, transformative, kind of radical form of resilience goes like, well, maybe the system wasn't that good in the beginning, so let's build up something new. This shock test just proves it that we need to really fundamentally change. And that it's a very human thing, but I think that might be the good news for Nordic and Baltic countries. We tend to be globally pretty good at this. Not perfect, but better.
I can't help but have one more question from my side. You mentioned that the EU, the European Commission, is kind of reconsidering the approach to industrial policy. Perhaps there will be some changes in the state aid framework. Could you be perhaps more specific about this?
So this in general is a good example of those tensions. Like I said in the beginning, that from the single market sort of ideology or principles sort of really would point out to regulation being used really mostly to sort of remove barriers from the four freedoms, so the movement of goods, capital, finances, and people. And as such, and yet national security is really in the competence of member states. So the Commission has been in the past fairly hostile towards countries using national security justifications to, for instance, direct state aid. Finland has been taken to court for the European Union Court of Justice of the EU as well on that. And but COVID changed a lot of this sort of attitude towards state aid, obviously. So this whole sort of realization that in some cases we just have to do it, and then there's sort of this strategic autonomy thinking started sort of creeping in. So as a sort of consequence, you have programs, especially now in the defense side, so the European Defense Fund and the European Defense Industry Program, EDIP, that kind of really specifically are now providing this sort of vehicle for doing this. So you kind of go through the European Commission instead of using national public funds towards subsidizing defense industry. So they're kind of rerouting it through the Commission, and now it's according to rules.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's also this bigger sort of change in thinking in terms of like I said, the European Green Deal, the Innovation Union. It kind of is creeping into everything now that there's this transformation in the attitudes. But the rules are not really set yet.
I see.
Exactly.
I see. But the thinking is there.
Yeah.
Good to know. I think that everyone who deals with, who is active in EU affairs, to promote Estonian competitiveness via the EU support framework should acknowledge that the transformation is there, and it's up to us also to help to design it.
Exactly, you can still shape it. Yeah. Don't just wait for it to be sort of dropped on you. But the commissions we had several talks with, close talk with the commission officials, and they're still a bit unclear in terms of what exactly they should do.
Reluctantly, I have to wrap up now, otherwise we go too far to another presentation's time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was both insightful and a needed discussion, and just wish you luck with your further work on the economic resilience issues. Hope to see you in Estonia back pretty soon.
Thank you, Aidata.
Good luck to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.